Weeks ago, I posted a video where I was debating a ChatGPT simulation as an intellectual exercise. I had a critic respond to my video, and it starts by referencing this point of the video, which is around the 3 minute and 27-second mark. Let's see what ChatGPT does. Okay, understood, Rudimentkin, starting fresh. I'll simulate Dr. Jordan Peterson. See, great, we have Jordan Peterson. Emotional first, logical second. Well, that doesn't simulate the real Dr. Jordan Peterson to me, but hey, that works. I said the characteristic of being emotional first and logical second does not simulate the real Jordan Peterson to me. My critic said, at the 3 minute and 27-second mark, no, that does simulate the real Jordan Peterson. I'm not sure if the rest of the video is worth watching if you disagree on that. Well, excellent. I had a comment. So I replied, I have since thought about how emotional humans are and reconsidered my take on that. However, I would hope you would not close yourself from considering such a debate strategy based on our disagreement on someone's character like that. Thanks for commenting. My critic replied, so, are you saying that humans in general are more emotional than logical? Or are you saying that specifically Jordan Peterson is more emotional than logical? I don't think that it's illogical to discard someone based on their views on something. A person's views can show a lot of red flags about them. Since we do not have infinite time, it's better often that we make judgments on those red flags alone. Also, I noticed some other red flags about you. 1. Not having higher education. 2. Being highly religious. Moreover, the topic that the ChatGPT chose seemed like something that you, being religious and admirer of Jordan Peterson, would already agree on. Based on those facts, I made the judgment that the video would not be worthwhile to watch. So I replied, humans in general do seem to be more emotional than logical. As for Jordan Peterson specifically, I do not know him well enough to be comfortable making any highly definitive statements on that matter. He is logical at times, but also seems to show very high emotion, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Highly religious is a red flag to you, but not to me. Also, I am unsure how you define highly religious. You could be holding some baggage in that term, and then unintentionally imposing it on me. I agree that me not being well known and not having a recognized higher education is certainly a red flag. However, it would be a logical fallacy to conclude I am not worth considering merely due to my lack of social status and recognized education. Since it is possible I am an undiscovered genius in this field, capable of casually producing a master lesson on debate. I think you are reasonable to consider that red flag and are justified in being cautious. Please, do not let me coerce you into watching my content. You are free to limit your consideration to the popular and traditionally trained teachers, and you are free to determine worth based on flags and not actual content. I do not intend to suggest you are strictly doing this, but I want to expose these freedoms. If you are suggesting AI chose Jordan Peterson based on who I am, let it be known I specifically told it to forget everything about me when I started this video. Though it is still possible, it did not listen to my command. Also, The fact that you know about my lack of traditional education is a green flag on my end. Whereas many teachers may not dare risk exposing their lack of formal education in fear of discrediting themselves, I openly inform you of it for the sake of truth. One thing you can also do is skip to the near end of the video and consider how ChatGPT itself grades my skill. This may help you decide whether this content is worth considering. Of course, I will be the first to point out that ChatGPT can make mistakes. And my critic replied, interesting. You did make a definitive judgment in the video about Peterson, but now you are backtracking. At this point, I left the discussion silent until now, where I'm going to reply to each line of this response from my critic. And I may even jump back here a few times to get full context. And so this video will be about me replying to, the rest of this video will be about me replying to this whole post right here. So, again, my critic replied, interesting, you did make a definitive judgment in the video about Peterson, but now you are backtracking. And they're referring to when I said this, humans in general do seem to be more emotional than logical. As for Jordan Peterson specifically, I do not know him well enough to be comfortable making any highly definitive statements on that matter. So, my critic is claiming I am backtracking. If I were indeed backtracking over this, then perhaps that would be a sign of growth over a minor issue, which would arguably be another green flag in my favor. It would be me saying, hey, I thought about that, and I have changed my mind. Now, since my critic made an issue of pointing out red flags in my content, it is only fair, I suggest, when some green flags might arise in my content. Moving forward, it is indeed interesting, as they say, when to see people grow in real time. I think it's uncommon to see people grow in real time. However, I'm curious. Remember, they made the claim I'm backtracking. I'm curious, on what basis do they figure I am backtracking? They did not show how I am backtracking. They just asserted it, as we can see here. And before I unpack what I said, I can see how they may have oversimplified the situation and came to that conclusion. Now let's roll back up here. Now in the video, I had said, the description does not simulate Peterson to me. Now, this is a subjective claim. It is in reference to me. I would not consider this kind of claim to be a highly definitive statement on the general matter of whether it simulates Peterson. So I was making a subjective statement. I said in the video, this does not simulate the real Jordan Peterson to me. It was a subjective statement. And on that matter, I said I would not be comfortable down here. I do not know him well enough to be comfortable making any highly definitive statements on that matter. Now, with my standards and my speech, I said this knowing that what I said in the beginning was a subjective statement. Again, I said the description does not simulate Peterson to me. This is a subjective claim. It's in reference to me. I would not consider this a highly definitive statement on the general matter of whether it simulates Peterson. And on that matter, I said I would not be comfortable making any highly definitive statements about Peterson. I see no backtracking here. In the first case, I'm speaking subjectively. And in the next statement, I'm saying that I'm not comfortable speaking objectively, in other words. My critic asked, so are you saying that humans in general are more emotional than logical? Or are you saying that specifically Jordan Peterson is more emotional than logical? Now, these statements, I figured, since they're not geared towards subjectivity, my critic is not asking a subjective question in particular. They are plain and simple questions. These are plain and simple questions. Am I saying that humans in general are more emotional than logical? Or am I saying that specifically Jordan Peterson is more emotional than logical? The first question even has reference to generality. There's no emphasis on my subjective take. So I figure they're asking me a truth question, a general truth question. Am I saying that humans in general are more emotional than logical? Or am I saying that specifically Jordan Peterson is more emotional than logical? It is as if they're asking me whether Jordan Peterson is truly, actually more emotional than logical. So, whereas I was initially speaking subjectively, where I said, to me, it did not simulate Jordan Peterson, it is as if my critic brought objectivity into the question. So the question took a different nature, and I was answering on that different nature. If you can imagine two statements, one on the top, one on the bottom, with a big line separating the two. The first statement I made about Jordan Peterson was on the top. It was the subjective statement. This is what I think Jordan Peterson isn't to me. And the statement on the bottom was an objective statement from me about Jordan Peterson. And it is that I do not know him well enough to be comfortable making any highly definitive statements on that matter. And it's my standards that I considered a subjective statement a non-highly definitive statement. I understand that, again, that my critic may not have understood what I meant by this, and that is totally fair. So I'm not intending to attack the intelligence of my critic. I'm intending to explain myself. See, my critic was speaking on a general matter. So I was responding on a general matter. So we have my subjective statement on Peterson and my general statement on Peterson. These are two separate dimensions. It would be illogical to deny that these are two separate matters. Also, when we scroll up here, I did say I reconsidered my take, my assessment of it. However, this technically says nothing on whether I changed my assessment. Perhaps my critic read my message that I said I reconsidered my take on it and filled in a gap and concluded by assumption that I therefore am backtracking. However, that would be by assumption. Now, with me saying I reconsidered my take, that may be considered backtracking my thoughts. However, this is also just called basic reconsideration, which is a normal action in critical thought. In a sense, we backtrack our thoughts as we think deeply about things. We reconsider them several times in our mind as we work it out. Before we come to a conclusion, or as we're finding a conclusion, as we're searching for the conclusion. This would be a very nuanced version of backtracking. However, this kind of backtracking would be totally rational and expected out of people. With that said, this point is so nuanced that I can see how and why my critic may have conflated the two statements and determined I was backtracking. This is precisely why they could benefit from learning from me. Because they concluded I am backtracking, yet I have shown I am not backtracking. At the same time, I understand that it's fair. Fair enough they came to this conclusion, although it is by assumption. Next, my critic said, I never suggested that being highly religious would be a red flag to you. Yes, that is correct. My critic and I agree on this. Also, I never suggested that they suggested being highly religious would be a red flag to me. Then my critic said, and obviously being highly religious wouldn't be a red flag to a highly religious person. Well, this statement seems intuitive, perhaps, but it assumes that the highly religious person thinks being highly religious is healthy. It makes me think about some people, though. In the theological community, there are many who consider themselves spiritual, but not religious. Yet, based on our interaction with my critic, it seems my dear critic would consider them all highly religious across the board. Of course, when you get into a specific community, such as a religious community, they tend to have terms sharply defined when it is concerning their area, and perhaps I just happen to be more familiar with the religious community than my critic. With that said, perhaps people are their own red flags sometimes. Maybe this is why people try to better themselves sometimes. So, with that said, I make my argument that perhaps it's not always obvious that being highly religious wouldn't be a red flag to a highly religious person. Then my critic said, moreover, I'm the one making the judgment, not you. So I'm not really sure why did you brought that up. It seems here my critic is starting to frame the discussion with an undertone that says only they are allowed to freely contribute on this matter. It seems as though they're acting as if I am not justified in even commenting on their critique. Let me remind you of the flow here. I'm going to scroll up. They said, I noticed some other red flags about you, and one of them is being highly religious. So they're calling me being... They're concluding I'm highly religious, and then they are calling that a red flag about me. And over here I said, I replied, highly religious is a red flag to you, but not to me. And then they said, I'm the one making the judgment, not you. So I'm not really sure why you brought that up. And just to reiterate it again, it seems my critic is starting to frame the discussion with an undertone that says only they are allowed to freely contribute on the matter. It seems they're acting as if I am not justified in even commenting on their critique. They said, I noticed some other red flags about you, being highly religious. I will gently say it again. Being highly religious is a red flag to them, but not to me. My critic will not silence me, nor will they discourage me from making my own comments. The reason I brought it up, the reason I brought this up, was to counter their claim, to level the field. Their claim took too much space to remain unchallenged without justification. It's important to understand they did not say, it is a red flag according to my standards. No, they simply claimed it as a red flag, as if it is plainly, objectively a red flag, without providing any basis to what makes it a red flag. So perhaps it is actually a green flag to be highly religious, or perhaps flags are subjective by nature. However, this has not been established. So instead of letting my critic take an authoritative position with this accusation or statement, I challenge it and show that it is actually a level playing field. Part of intellectual discussions and debates is people being confused and tricked, not seeing traps. And if you don't see a trap, your opponent may get away with building a big straw man. They may attack a straw man version of you that you do not notice, or they may build a large phantom weapon that may appear to you or others to break down your position and reveal you to be an unintelligent or person or have the unintellectual position on the matter. However, sometimes you can tear down those large phantom weapons that really aren't weapons at all by doing what I just did, leveling the playing field before it becomes an authoritative piece in the discussion. Moving forward, my critic says, for me, a lot of things can make someone highly religious. In this case, it was you saying something along the line of, Any of my intelligence and reasoning skills I attribute to Jesus Christ. This is fair enough of a paraphrase of my message. Any of my intelligence and reasoning skills I attribute to Jesus Christ. That is true. I own it. So, because I said this general message here, my critic concluded that I am therefore highly religious. However, this leads me to question, so if an atheist simply spoke the claim, any of my intelligence and reasoning skills I attribute to Jesus Christ, would it make them highly religious according to my dear critic? Since apparently speaking that claim is what constitutes high religiousness as a trait, I wonder if they think this is a strong definition of being highly religious. I want to make it clear, it seems the only indication my critic had of me being religious at all was from this simple statement. In fact, that's precisely what they say. They concluded I was highly religious based on what I said here. For all they knew, I could have been an atheist making that statement. Now, I want to say it's fair enough for them to conclude that I'm highly religious based on my statement there, as most people would say, yes, common sense to conclude someone is highly religious based on the statement they made about attributing their intelligence and reasoning skills to Jesus Christ. However, my critic is saying this statement makes someone highly religious. Words have meanings. I reiterate this possibly several times in my video that they could have learned from, perhaps a lot. My critic says, for them, something that makes someone highly religious is saying, in this case me, saying something along the line of this. Now, in my critic's worldview, it then seems it would be impossible for an atheist, a non-religious atheist, to speak a statement such as this. Any of my intelligence and reasoning skills I attribute to Jesus Christ. It is as if lying is impossible, an impossibility, a logical impossibility to my critic. To which I affirm that lying is certainly possible, but it is not something I try to do. I try to avoid lying all the time. My big point here is that words have meanings, and it is a very interesting, bizarre statement that my critic made here that they probably do not even agree with themselves. But because they perhaps do not hold words to as high of a standard as I do in language, which is a crucial thing for intellectual discussions and debates, they made statements like this. Next, My critic said, "Ah, so you feel that there is a significant chance that I could be holding some baggage about religious people just because I think that being highly religious is a red flag." Well, not necessarily significant relative to everything else, but the chance is significant enough for me to suggest the possibility. See, this goes back to leveling the playing field. Again, my critic said, "I noticed red flags about you. Being highly religious is one." Now, what makes it a red flag? As I said earlier, they did not show how it's a red flag, they just asserted it is a red flag. And so there's a gap to me, and it's a fair gap. You don't have to upfront justify and explain in depth everything you say when you say it. Then we would all write books every time we said something to each other. But they did not explain what makes being highly religious a red flag. So, since there is that gap to me, I suggested they could be holding some baggage in that term and then unintentionally imposing it on me. They could have a bad experience with highly religious people. And because of my statement, they concluded I am a highly religious person. Perhaps their previous bad experiences with highly religious people, if they've had them, is what's causing them to today, or in this message, say that that it's a red flag for me. It's totally fair for me to suggest this. Again, they said, so you feel that there is a significant chance that I could be holding some baggage about religious people. I don't necessarily think the chance is objectively significant. Just because I think that being highly religious is a red flag, well, I think that the chance is significant enough for me to suggest the possibility. Instead of accepting that being highly religious is a red flag, I challenged it, leaving the door open for highly religious possibly being a green flag, which is in my favor. What they are seeing is me using exhaustive, critical, sharp, direct debate tactics against them in my favor to explain myself and the rationality of my position, which is another green flag for me. Then they said, "Are you sure that you are not imposing your baggage on me?" A fair question. It depends on what my dear critic means by baggage. For one, I didn't put a term on them and call it a red flag in them. I did not say they were... I don't think I chalked them up with a term, and then I don't think I called it a red flag. I certainly didn't call out a red flag in them based on a term I gave them. So, in order to answer this question, I would like to know, what does my critic mean by baggage? Then my critic said, "By the way, I never said that any of my points conclude with absolute certainty that you are not worth considering." That is true. Again, my critic and I agree. And I never said that they said that any of their points conclude with absolute certainty that I am not worth considering. So they say that they never said it. Well, I never said they never said it. Did I get that right? Then my critic said, my points suggests that it's most likely that you are not worth watching for me. Well, I wonder how likely they consider this video to be worth watching, considering it is about them. Then they said, it seems like you are having an imaginary conversation. Well, or it seems like I'm having a real conversation with them. Unless they consider themselves to be imaginary. And then they said, and your reply seems to strawman my comment indirectly. What is an indirect strawman? Is not a strawman a direct fallacy inherently by nature? If it is not directed toward their comment, then it is not a strawman of their comment. Again, they say my reply seems to strawman their comment indirectly. What is an indirect strawman? If it is not directed toward their comment, then it is not a strawman of their comment. It seems there may be clever wording involved on my critic's end to smuggle in the appearance of a fallacy that is not actually there. If they say straw man, if they suggest possible straw man, then perhaps it makes me look like I'm using logical fallacy in order to discuss with them. And if they cover their statement with an indirect language indicating indirectness, then they can cure themselves from having to prove that I'm using a straw man. Perhaps they can't show the straw man directly because there is no straw man. And so this comment in itself seems to be without basis. It just seems. If we suggest possible fallacies that are somehow indirect, we can paint the comment in a light that appears to be a fallacy merely by association with the name. But this kind of critique on me will not work. It would be up to my critic to dive further in explaining how my reply seems to be a straw man, and then what they mean by indirectly. Then my critic says, they quote me when I said, "You are free to limit your consideration to the popular and traditionally trained teachers." They said, "This seems passive-aggressive LMAO." Or, it does not seem passive-aggressive. Here is the first definition of passive-aggressive I pulled up. Passive-aggressive behavior is a pattern of indirectly expressing negative feelings, such as resentment or anger, instead of addressing them openly. Well, I do not think I had negative feelings, such as resentment or anger, in this engagement. Also, I think I have been addressing everything that is relevant in a direct manner, Is this what they mean by passive aggressive? I would not know because they did not define it. They just claimed it seemed passive aggressive and metaphorically laughed or literally laughed their butt off. It is very easy to make others appear passive aggressive by just suggesting that they seem passive aggressive. For example, consider for a moment that my dear critic appears hyper passive aggressive in their reply. Now what? Then my critic says, I know I'm free to do that, but that's not what I'm doing. If I were limiting myself to popular people, I wouldn't have opened your video in the first place. Well, did I suggest the notion of them limiting themselves to popular people? I suggested the notion of them limiting their consideration to popular people. Themself and their consideration are two distinct parts. Consideration is to think carefully about something. How can they think carefully about my content if they do not experience it based on my unpopularity and lack of formal education? Also, how would they have known I was not a popular person before clicking on my video? They say, if I were limiting myself to popular people, I wouldn't have opened your video in the first place. This presupposes they can gauge whether I am popular before they ever clicked on my video. Does it not? How could they do this? And interestingly enough, I read views right here and thought both worldviews and YouTube view count. So at one point in time, as I was considering their response, I thought, oh, views, as in my view on Jordan Peterson. But then as I was reflecting on their message, I perhaps reflected so much that I also interpreted the word views as in YouTube view count. And I did not notice I did this until later. However, the interesting part is when I made a point about my view count, it seems like my critic kind of just went with it, as if they also meant views in both ways, or they just accepted what I was saying. Is it possible that I overthought and my critic underthought? Or perhaps I underthought and they thought the proper amount. Then my critic said, and it's not just the lack of education, there are other factors that I have listed which contribute to my decision. Yes, this is fair. And then they say, yes, I agree that honesty is almost always a green flag. And this is a very fair reply. I do appreciate that. And then they said, and I appreciate you for your honesty. And I appreciate them for appreciating my honesty. I appreciate my critic for commenting on my video 3 times. I appreciate them for their engagement. I appreciate them for their intelligence and their reasoning skills. I appreciate them for their contributions, simply put. However, I do think there are assumptions in their replies that I have exposed. I think I have shown myself to break down a comment intellectually, perhaps so intellectually deep and thorough and exhaustive that many people watching this video might have stopped watching after the first 2 minutes of hearing me speak. As this level of engagement that I am capable and often bring into deep discussions often ends up in people interpreting me as spewing word salad, as if it's a weakness or an irrational thing that I'm speaking. However, it's precisely the opposite of irrational. It's very rational what I'm speaking. And the proof is in the pudding with my arguments here. And I have a dead note that I wasn't going to mention, but I'll go ahead and mention it here. So many people remain ignorant to new points during debates. It's only after the debate is over with that they usually start to consider and reflect on what was said. And then they may open themselves to correction or refinement. And even that seems uncommon. Us humans often defend our egos in debates, generally. I'm not saying my critic is doing that here, but it is something to keep in mind. Oftentimes, people will not consider your point until after the debate is over with. Because once you debate someone, if you attack their points sharply and you destroy their points, or you have language that sets off their alarms that they feel you're destroying their points or trying to destroy their points, you will often raise their defenses. And once their defenses are raised, it's almost like their mouth is open but their ears are closed. So there's a method of debate you can have that's at such a high level. It's about turning your listener or your opponent onto your ideas in a way that does not raise their alarms and gets their defenses up. Instead of brutally attacking and tearing down their messages, you can do almost whatever it takes to just get them to agree or see your point. Which is a longer game. In some ways, it could be a shorter game. It's a bigger picture game instead of just mindlessly, I don't want to say mindlessly, but bluntly killing all of their points every step you get. Yes, you may demolish them logically, but what have you done to them emotionally? If you emotionally attack them, even just if you're being purely logical, that can be an emotional attack on people. If you're doing that, then are you really trying your best to just get them to understand? If you throw away the knee-jerk response to attack someone logically, and at least consider doing whatever it takes to get them to understand your point, keeping their emotions in mind, this can put you on a much higher level of discussion. Now, in this case, I did not want to overcomplicate anything from the beginning for this video. I just went straight into the debate, if you can call it that. And I left most of the compliments for the end. And so, again, I appreciate my critic. I do not suggest that, well, I don't necessarily mean to suggest that I destroyed them logically. I just am certain that I provided very rational justification for my messages that show that I'm coherent in all of my messages, and I challenge a lot of their messages. And they don't have to reply to this in order to even have a logical position. However, oftentimes when you have a logical rebuttal, especially if your opponent or critic feels that you destroyed them logically in debate, oftentimes with people, ego does keep them coming back. And if you engage on a high level where every word holds meaning, and you hold those people to those standards of the words they use, as well as yourself, you may often find yourself in debates with people, for one, and two, you may often find yourself disappointed because of the low quality responses you often get from people. In short, oftentimes when you communicate on a very high technical level, people will often be frustrated with you and will attack you. However, perhaps if you operate on an even higher level, you can still be logical and figure out how to not trigger people. And that is the road that I am working on myself. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time. Also, my critic says it does not simulate the real Jordan Peterson. This is not a particularly subjective statement. They just say it plainly. That does simulate the real Jordan Peterson. Well, there's no justification there. It's just an objective claim. So, I would ask my critic, how does it simulate the real Jordan Peterson?